All right. Hey, everyone. We're going to give this a couple minutes to let folks who've registered join. We'll be talking and discussing the legislative and congressional maps released by both the Republican and democratically appointed commissioners, and talking about the implications that they have, especially for communities of color, for sovereign tribes, for voting rights. And at the end, we'll be able to take any questions that you might have about the maps, about the redistricting process, about how you can get involved and make sure that fair and just maps are drawn this go around. And we'll also have some opportunities throughout the discussion to share a couple clips of videos and interviews conducted by community leaders from Redistricting Justice for Washington, talking about how they feel about redistricting and what their perspectives are. So give us a couple moments and we'll play a video shortly and then get started after that.
Right now, the political future of Washington State is being determined. We need to make sure that our communities' voices are heard.
Every 10 years, after everyone gets counted in the census, Washington redraws the boundaries of our political districts. The district you live in determines who you can vote for, and it determines how much voting power your community has. We need to speak up to keep communities of color and tribes together, not splitting them up between districts and watering down the power of our vote.
Join Redistricting Justice for Washington in keeping the Redistricting Commission accountable so that our districts represent and empower us. Get involved at redistrictingjusticewa.org.
All right. So who you just heard was the esteemed and great Margot, who's joining us today to talk about these maps, and Patsy Whitefoot, an elderly leader with the Yakima Nation, and also one of the leaders of Redistricting Justice for Washington. My name is Kamau. I lead Washington Community Alliance. We're a coalition of over 50 organizations of color and tribes across Washington state. We were originally founded to get out the count for the 2020 census and evolved to focus on broader issues of multiracial democracy. One of the ways is to make sure that communities of color were counted in the democracy, and now's the hard work of making sure our structures and systems reflect that. And as we get started here, I'm going to turn to everybody on our panel and let each of you, starting with Margot, and then we can go to Andrew and Colin, share a bit about yourself, your work, and we'll go from there.
Thanks, Kamal. Hi, everyone. My name is Margot Spinola. I use she, her. I am an organizer with Latino Community Fund and a member and a lead of Redistricting Justice for Washington. And I'm originally from Eastern Washington, so I grew up in Tricities, and I now find myself in Seattle. And, you know, like Kamal, I'm really interested and passionate about issues of multiracial democracy and making sure that we are fairly represented in all aspects of government and community. So I'll pass it off to Andrew. Thanks for having me.
Hi, all. My name is Andrew Hong. I use he, him pronouns. I'm one of the statewide leads for Redistricting Justice for Washington. I'm based and I grew up my whole life and lived my whole life in South Seattle in the 37th Legislative District and 9th Congressional District. And yeah, I lead communications and organizing here at RJW for fair maps for communities of color that we'll talk more about in a little bit.
Hi, everyone. My name is Colin Cole. I'm Policy Director at More Equitable Democracy. More Equitable Democracy is a racial justice organization, and we focus on electoral systems and how those have a direct impact on the abilities for communities of color to have access to political power and influence policy. I was born and raised in Snohomish, Washington. Various times I've been in a different Snohomish districts and LDs, but that's where I am right now, up in Linwood, in what could be the first ever majority minority district in Snohomish County, and happy to be here with everyone else.
All right. So this is going to be our panel. If folks are joining us either on Twitter on Periscope or watching this on Facebook Live, be sure to also be following Redistricting Justice for Washington, Latino Community Fund, and More Equitable Democracy. And then in the comments, if you have questions as we go along, please drop them there, and we'll make sure to touch on them as we go, and certainly at the end. All right, so I think we can dig in here. Yesterday, Tuesday the 28th, the Redistricting Commission, each 4 of the appointed and voting members, released their version of the congressional maps that they would like to see implemented. And last week on Tuesday, they released the maps for legislative districts that each of them would like to see implemented, and they're a great view of what each of their perspectives are on how to balance out a lot of key issues in Washington State. In the Constitution, in the RCW, these maps are supposed to make sure that they're compact, that they keep in mind communities of interest, and balance a whole host of things. So I think we wanted to start by looking at the stakes and why this is so important. These maps are going to shape the political terrain for Washington State for the next decade. And for a long time years, Washington State has been diversifying, and we saw that really clearly in the 2020 census. There are multiple majority minority counties now, multiple majority Latino counties, and that hasn't always reflected the ways in which communities of color are proportionally part of the population. That hasn't translated into votes or voting power or representation in either legislature or Congress. And that's why there's such huge stakes between now and when the commission is set to finalize the maps in mid-November. We're going to need all hands on deck, and everybody who is interested in fair and just districts getting involved in making sure that the commission knows what you think, what you want to see. And part of that is going to include make sure we really understand what's going on with the maps. I want to start off with some of the terms that people are going to hear us use a lot, since Redistricting Justice for Washington, the coalition that we're all a part of, is very interested in representation for communities of color and the power of voters of color. We'll be talking a lot about a term called CVAP, C-V-A-P, and we'll also be talking a lot about majority minority districts. And so, Margot, if I wanted to turn to you first to kind of give the broadest overview of what those two terms mean.
Yeah, sure. So if you're tuning in for the first time, or you're wanting to know a basic sense of redistricting, yeah, we're gonna throw a lot of acronyms around. One of them being Citizen Voting Age Population, or CVAP as we call it. And so essentially CVAP means the population of eligible voters in the district. And so when we look at this in regards to like majority minority, they are similar but different. So CVAP is important when it comes to redistricting, because districts that have a large population of people of color doesn't mean that they have a lot of voters of color, right? So it's possible that a commissioner may draw a district with a lot of kids of color, but kids can't vote, and that matters. And so It's really important that we draw districts, or when we're looking at districts, we're looking in order to like increase representation. We got to look at CVAP. We got to look at citizen voting age population, or more so people of color citizen voting age population, which is something that's important to us. Yeah, go ahead.
Definitely. And Colin, would you have anything to add around terms, acronyms, or things people might hear us discussing that if they're getting involved for the first time or haven't delved into this recently, might want to get familiar with?
Yeah, totally. So CVAP is usually the metric that we want to look at to make sure that we're actually providing communities of color with the ability to elect candidates of choice. Because like Margot just said, if there's a bunch of people of color who aren't voters, that doesn't help voters of color elect candidates. But interestingly, most of the analysis you're going to see today is about voting age population, which does not include citizens, meaning it does not include voters. The reason for that is because the Census Bureau has decided to stop collecting citizen voting age population as part of the census itself. This is sort of rooted in the fact that previous administrations made certain people not feel comfortable disclosing their citizenship status when they were filling out the census, which led to that data potentially being unreliable. So a lot of what we have to go off of is voting age population, which means it's really important to overshoot, because we know that there are more people of color and people voting age people of color than there are citizens voting age people of color. And in fact, the last time we got CVAP data and VAP data from the 2019 American Community Survey, which is done by the Census Bureau but isn't the census, when comparing that with the 2020 census results, we can see that they actually underestimated how many people of color were living in our communities. So we are looking primarily at 2020 census data, VAP numbers, and that's why it's important to make these districts have more than just 50% or 51% people of color, because that doesn't actually mean that people of color will be able to elect candidates in those districts. You need a bigger number than that.
Awesome. So very wonky, but equally as important. So the commissioners are supposed to make sure that the districts they draw are equal, they're compact, meaning the shapes can't be too wacky, they're contiguous and connected. You can get from one end to the other once. We're one of just a few states that actually also ask them to consider competitiveness, preserves political subdivisions like counties and cities and school districts, and also preserves communities of interest, the ones that we're talking about right now. One of the biggest takeaways of this process for people like us who really care about multiracial democracy is looking at all four commissioners. It's so clear just how flawed of a system we have, where we have single winner districts inside of a winner takes all system. So the reason some of these metrics are really important is unless you are 50+1% of the eligible voting age electorate, your community isn't necessarily able to elect the candidate of the choice on their own. And the reason that's so perverse is in almost all the congressional districts, it means that the pool of eligible voters, the majority of them are white, even though we're a state that is almost 40% people of color. And we have that same pattern replicate itself in the legislative districts. So that's why all this is so critical. I want to share a little bit about, we discussed this with the example of a locality with one of the folks from More Equitable Democracy, George, about what a proportional representation system could look like and why that would be better, not just from a racial justice standpoint, but also because having multi-winner districts means it's impossible for parties to gerrymander. Are we able to pull up that short clip so people have a good understanding of what proportional representation could look like?
if your community or party are 40% of the electorate, you should win 40% of the seats. But let's take King County, for example. King County, we kind of pride ourselves on being ahead of the curve. Well, that's Renton, in terms of being forward thinking. But do you know how many people of color have ever been elected to King County Council?
Oh no, how many?
4. And so instead of 9 single member districts where you have to essentially run 9 popularity contests, the person with the most money and the most name recognition wins. You could have 3 districts of 3 each. We could use ranked choice voting and rank our candidates, and then the top 3 would win. That means instead of having to win 50 plus 1 to win, you could win with about 25% of the electorate, which lowers the threshold and therefore allows different communities to elect candidates of choice. I could see that, candidates of choice for people of color could be elected in like a South King County district for sure, probably one on the east side, and maybe another one in like shoreline area where there's also significant concentrations of communities of color. That's not the only way to do it, but it is one that is popular with a number of cities that started to adopt it at the beginning of the 1900s. So it's not a new thing. It's actually a really interesting, rich, and hidden history.
Great. So a better way of doing things is possible. It's also the way most countries do it. Sweden, New Zealand, but that's not the situation we find ourselves in. We have to work inside of our flawed system. And one example that's very similar to what George just talked about in that video is our congressional districts. In 2010, we won a new congressional district, or I shouldn't say we won, we earned one through the increase of population. This time around, we didn't, but the work that a previous iteration of a group like Redistricting Justice for Washington had won is a majority minority district that is currently the 9th congressional district. And of course, this means that communities of color are 40%, almost 40% of the state now. And in just 1 out of the 10, so 10% of the congressional districts is where we compose a majority of the population, and means that salience of those issues from our communities are really important, even if we're not necessarily the majority of voters. So I want to turn over to you, Andrew. You had a great op-ed in The Stranger outlining the way commissioners ought to consider drawing the 9th congressional district. And I want to ask, what were your first thoughts and your general thoughts about what we saw yesterday from the commissioners regarding the 9th?
Yeah, thank you, Kamau. So yeah, the 9th Congressional District, again, RJW's biggest priority was making sure that we preserve this district as a majority people of color district, or majority minority congressional district. And just off the bat, like when we had a win with these maps, all 4 of the commissioners, or we had a small one with these maps, all 4 of the commissioners drew a majority minority 9th district. And so we applaud all of the commissioners for doing that. However, again, going to that CVAP acronym, Citizen Voting Age Population, we want to be drawing a 9th district that gets to a majority minority citizen voting age population number. That way, communities of color have enough eligible voters to make up a majority of the 9th district electorate. And unfortunately, just given the census data, we're not able to do that now, but we can draw a district that maximizes the minority population in the 9th, so that, say, in 2024, 2026, when South King County continues to get more diverse, we can reach that majority minority CVAP number. And so I think now is a good time to just kind of look at each of the map proposals from each of the commissioners and see how do they draw a district in the context of, will it get to a CVAP statistic by, in the next few years. So this is a map of our current RJW proposal. On the left side, you can see the current 9th district. By 2019 American Community Survey estimates it's 44% citizen voting age population minority. And our district drew a district that maximized the people of color CVAP in CVAP population in the district to 46%. And now we can compare these our RJW proposal on the right to all of the, to all of the different commissioners. So this first one is Commissioner April Sims' proposal. Actually, can I go back for a couple slides? Cool. I also want to know another thing that we're really looking at in, or another key factor into drawing our RJW proposed 9th congressional district is looking at individual communities of color and how they intersect and how the district as a whole intersects with the issue of socioeconomic status and class. Communities of color in South Seattle and South King County are predominantly working class, and whereas communities in Bellevue and the east side suburbs do have a substantial people of color population, those are much more upper class communities with different political interests. And so another value that went into drawing this 9th district was how do we uplift working class communities of color that represent the majority base of this district and draw a working class district. And so that's specifically why, along with increasing the POC population, we drew more areas of South King County, including White Center, Burien, Auburn, and then also going down to the Muckleshoot Reservation into the 9th district and drawing out wealthy communities like Mercer Island and Bellevue. Okay.
And these are the community-led maps. We did a ton of town halls with organizations of color, APACE, the Seattle Metropolitan Urban League, and dozens of others, and they've been endorsed by dozens of community leaders, including one of the big campaigns to make sure that the 9th was saved as a genuine majority minority district. So that's important for listeners. Now, what did you think of April Sims' map, the Democratic appointee to the commission? And we can go through each of the commissioners. You could take us through each of the commissioners and how they drew the 9th.
Perfect. So each of the commissioners drew a map that didn't maximize the people of color population in the 9th. Commissioner Sims specifically here drew a majority minority district, but not one that would get to the CVAP statistic as fast as it could be. And the reason why is because she drew South Seattle, you see here, is currently in the 7th district. It's that southeastern part of the city of Seattle. And that is the home of the most dense Black community in Washington state, as well as a very dense Asian American community. And this is harmful in two ways. One, again, the 9th district is less diverse, has less people of color in it with that decision. And number two, the community I'm from, South Seattle, it's a very different community than the rest of the 7th district. The rest of the city of Seattle, which is the 7th district here, is majority white. It's much more upper income, and they have different political priorities than those in South Seattle, different political issues that affect our communities. And by drawing South Seattle into the 7th district, you're taking South Seattle away from a district where their issues represent the majority of the 9th district voters, the base of the 9th district, and putting them in their issues into a district where the majority of constituents have different priorities, are majority white, are majority higher income, and that marginalizes and silences communities of color, working class communities of color in South Seattle. So again, kind of a summary, we appreciate that the 9th is majority minority here, but we can increase the population of people of color in the 9th and also give South Seattle better representation by drawing the South End into the 9th district. And then this is Commissioner Graves' proposal. Commissioner Graves prioritized creating 2 majority minority congressional districts. The 9th and the 10th are both majority minority by population, but not by citizen voting age population. And he did this by dividing South King County here into the 9th and the 10th, and also splitting the county lines from Pierce to King to draw in the communities of color in Tacoma. By dividing the communities of color in South King County, it effectively stops any potential majority CVAP district from being created here before the next census. Again, our goal is to create a majority CVAP congressional district, and the only way to really do that is to create a district that maximizes people of color by drawing all of South King County into one district. And additionally here, the similar problem with Commissioner Sims' map for South Seattle, and also parts of Renton here and even parts of Kent, it lumps those working class communities of color in South Seattle, Renton, and Kent into a district where I think the majority of the population live in Mercer Island, Medina, Bellevue, Sammamish, and parts of Issaquah. Those working class voices are just going to be a minority in this 9th district, and it marginalizes communities of color that would have the majority base of the voices in our proposed 9th district.
And this is actually a good place for people to understand what are the political implications for majority minority districts versus districts that either now or over the course of the coming years will become electorates that are majority people of color. So if you could create a majority minority district like Margot touched on earlier, it does mean that you raise the saliency of those constituents, even if they themselves are not able to vote. So you have a community that of young parents. The person representing that place is ideally going to understand that there's like a higher salience of issues for children, and the same thing with different communities. The issue, though, is what you outlined, right? Which is, even though you create these two majority minority districts where it means the saliency of the issues might be different, it does mean that it does make it impossible for between now and the next 10 years for any one of these electorates to be majority people of color. In other words, there would be no chance of voters of color being able to elect the candidate of their choice on their own. And it would guarantee that all 10 congressional districts in Washington state have majority white electorates. Is that right, Colin? Do I have that right?
So it's always difficult to say with total certainty, but that would be our projection, yes.
That's great. And yeah, Andrew, take us through what other commissioners did and how they approached the 9th.
Yeah, before we get to Commissioner Walkinshaw's proposal, I just want to also point out that Commissioner Graves' map here, talking about keeping communities together, divides the Chinatown International District in half between the 9th and the 7th district, I believe. And additionally, with April Sims' map, it puts the Chinatown International District in a majority white district at the 7th. And, you know, protecting communities of color means not dividing them and putting them, when possible, into majority people of color districts. Okay, cool. With that point, we can go to Commissioner Walkinshaw's proposal. So Commissioner Walkinshaw drew this map is with the 9th district that has the largest people of color population and is the most similar to Redistricting Justice for Washington's proposal. It does a good job of keeping South King County intact into one district. It kind of gives it kind of like compromises or like gives us in terms of comparing South Seattle and East Side, kind of does 50-50. I'll explain that better, but Commissioner Walkinshaw's map for the 9th in South Seattle kind of divides the north half of South Seattle and the south side of South Seattle between the 9th and the 7th, and then also going into the Bellevue area. He keeps South Bellevue and Newcastle into the 9th, but then redraws Mercer Island and North Bellevue into, I think that's the 8th district. Again, this is our favorite map proposal, but we would just like to see an increase of people of color in this district by drawing in more of South Seattle, ideally going up to the International District, Chinatown, and then cutting out those very wealthy communities in South Bellevue and Newcastle. And again, we've heard from many communities, many activists and Asian American activists in Chinatown and in Seattle and across the state that, you know, keeping Chinatown in the majority people of color district is how we empower that community in the Chinatown district. But yeah, I think that wraps up Walkinshaw. And then for Commissioner Fain's map is pretty similar to Commissioner Sims' map. All it does, or the differences between Sims and Fain, is that this map goes further into Issaquah on the east side. So it extends further into the east side and cuts out a bit more of South King County. But just like Sims's map, it puts South Seattle and also a bit of all of Skyway into the 7th district, which effectively makes those South Seattle and Skyway working class communities of color into a district that is majority white, and it marginalizes those voices. And also it doesn't maximize the people of color population statistic in the 9th district as much as it could be and much as it is in RJW's 9th district proposal. So to kind of overview our feedback for the 9th district, our goal as a coalition is to create a majority citizen voting age population CVAP 9th district for people of color. We can't do that now, but we can set us up by maximizing the people of color in the 9th district to get there in 2, 4, 6 years. And also we want to make sure that working class communities of color in South Seattle and South King County are kept together where they can represent working class majority base of a district. And that means that also drawing out wealthier communities that don't share the same interests. Cool.
That is a great overview, and we're diving in deep and plugging right along. There's lots of other interesting things that happened with the congressional maps that we may touch on at the end here or during questions. But I think now we want to take a look at another really priority area for redistricting this year, which is Yakima County and the ability to draw a majority minority district by citizen voting age population, the first district that would have an electorate composed of a majority of voters of color that is possible in Eastern Washington, east of the mountains. So I think first we'll queue up a video of some interviews we did to get folks who are watching caught up on some of the history and context in Yakima.
All evidence tells us that Native Americans vote for Latino candidates between 85 to 95% of the time. Most of the evidence tells us that Latinos and Native Americans are a cohesive political bloc and political community, and it is possible to give those communities a chance to elect a candidate of their choice. I don't see any reason why the commission could not put the Yakima Nation as a whole in a district where the majority of the population and the majority of the voters are Latino.
So when we take a look at the demographics of Central Washington, there's a long history that we have of living together and, of course, working together. Over the years, there's been much done with communities of colors coming together and working on common issues or common goals that we have, particularly around the census. That makes a significant difference in how you're going to consider the politics around voting, but also consider the politics around legislative district representation and congressional representation. This time, I think the constituents and communities of interest advocated for changes in the makeup of the commission. We made nominations for individuals to be considered, and they were predominantly people of color, as opposed to 10 years ago, when I understand it was an all-white commission.
We as a community need to break away from that, from thinking that our politicians will not listen to us, from thinking that it's impossible for anyone to run, so why even try? The Redistricting Commission has the opportunity to break those molds and cast something new and give us candidates who will listen to the community, who will come from the community and understand what is going on.
At Redistricting Justice for Washington, we are fighting for political districts that prioritize people over politicians, keep tribal lands together, and preserve the political power of communities of
All right. So some really important issues going on in Yakima, especially when it comes to voting rights and the tribal sovereignty of the Yakima Nation that go way, way back and have long roots. Margot, I want to bring you in here to share a little bit about what you saw in Yakima. We also now know that how the 14th and the 15th legislative districts are drawn in Yakima County have an effect on what's possible for the communities of color that live in Tri-Cities. But what were your first thoughts when you saw the commissioners release their legislative maps for Yakima?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I'm very happy, very proud of the work just we as a coalition have done to make sure that our voices are heard, and the meetings that we've had with each of and all of the commissioners regarding keeping the Yakima Nation together, because our voices were heard and it happened. So all 4 commissioners kept the Yakima Nation intact in each of their in their map proposals. So you can go ahead and go to the first slide. We can just dive right in. But yeah, essentially, lots of communities of color in the city of Yakima and the surrounding areas, where we're looking very specifically at making sure that the Latino community in the city of Yakima, and especially in the East Valley, was not split, and the Yakima Nation was kept intact. And just like our friend David said in the video, Native communities and Latinos vote, very similarly across time in elections. And so it's really important for us to make sure that we're holding a district with those 2 communities there in order to create a district that is proportional and representative of communities of color. So this is the map that we proposed, keeping the nation intact and making sure that the Latino population was kept together in Yakima. Here is, as you can see, a map depicting the percentage of people of color by precinct, the Yakima Nation being that big blob there. And you can go to the next slide. We'll dive into Commissioner Sin's map. And so what we're hearing from community is that April Sin's map is the best option, although not ideal. So what it does is that it's likely the most beneficial to Latinos in Yakima. And what it does is it keeps these kind of smaller surrounding towns around Yakima, like Union Gap, Wapato, Toppenish, Granger, that are increasingly getting Latino. They're keeping that together. But then when you start to dig in into around the city of Yakima, so what ends up coming up is that it eats up this higher income parts of central Yakima, which is, I believe, Terrace Heights and Moxie. And so you can't really see, we're not really digging into the map super closely, but that poses an issue for a lot of folks. So what it tends to happen was it's making it slightly more white in the process than what the community proposed map does. And so the solution there is to draw out Terrace Heights and Moxie. I believe even extending the district, I think, more west through 24th Avenue and 40th Avenue South. And just drawing more of those compact surrounding districts instead of how the current 14th legislative district does. And we can go on to the next slide. And so, Commissioner Graves tends to go a little bit in a different direction. So with Commissioner Graves, we are looking at the breaking up of Latino voters. They're not able to elect a candidate of their choice. If you really dig in there, what his map does is that it splits the Latino community in Yakima. And if you're not from Yakima, how we look at it is there's the East Valley and then there's the West Valley. The West Valley tends to be predominantly white versus the East Valley is more communities of color. And so what he does is that he tends to split the city there. And I think also when you're looking at Graves' map is that town after town down the valley along the highway, they're located in different districts. And so like I mentioned before, these towns like Wapato and Granger and so on and so forth are getting increasingly POC, people of color, then that poses an issue of splitting those communities. So you can go to the next one, please. Communities have looked at Waukeshaw's map, and while it is not preferred over April Sims, it's probably the second best for Latino voters specifically. I think one comment that was made was that it includes certain parts of Klickitat County that are needlessly white, and so that splits up the Latino population in Yakima City. And so we can move on to, I think, Fain. Yeah, and Fain's map are doing very similarly to what Commissioner Graves has proposed. Latinos don't have a numerical majority of CVAP because it cuts out, like I said before, Wapato and Toppenish. And like my friend David talked before, Latinos and Native voters are this cohesive political bloc, and so what his map tends to do is they splits it right in half. So he doesn't even include he doesn't even include Yakima with the Yakima Nation. So he splits those communities, and just not our best looking map for the coalition that we're picking. But that's being nice.
That's a really incredible overview. Now, there's going to be a lot to dig in here. People heard from David Morales, who's a civil rights lawyer in Yakima County. Yakima County, over the last few years, has had several voting rights lawsuits. But I think before jumping into that, one thing that's very clear is that the commissioners have a tough job here for any community to have one benefit or be kept together community interest. Because of our winner-takes-all system, and these are single winner districts, it does mean that they're having to trade off a different thing that they might weigh. And I think one of the big takeaways that folks watching can really grasp onto is this is a huge victory for the Yakima Nation, which has been split for the last 10 years, and by consequence means the votes of their members have been diluted. And it's really something to see that all the commissioners at least gave a really strong effort to make sure that the Yakima Nation's reservation was intact in a single district, something that community leaders have been asking for. So I think for all of the constructive feedback that I think commissioners are definitely going to get in the coming weeks, that is something that all of them try to do across the different parties. That said, some of what Margot shared with the division of different cities does look like it could pose some voting rights issues. So Colin, I wanted to turn to you to share what implications you see here for the Federal Voting Rights Act. And then for people who might be watching that are at least somewhat familiar with the fact that we have our own Washington State Voting Rights Act, if that's relevant at all when it comes to these maps.
Yeah, so there's a lot of voting rights implications for these maps for Yakima, and also a lot of voting rights history for the Yakima region. Folks may be aware that about a decade ago, in 2010, there was a lawsuit filed against the city of Yakima under the Federal Voting Rights Act that was brought by the ACLU of Washington. And the result of that, after a lot of money spent on behalf of the city to defend themselves, was that the city was found in violation of the Federal Voting Rights Act, and they had to change the way they conduct their elections because they found that the way those elections were being conducted had an effect of diluting the voting power of the Latino community in the city of Yakima. At the start of 2020, there was a Washington State Voting Rights Act lawsuit filed against Yakima County. The Washington Voting Rights Act does a lot of what the Federal Voting Rights Act does, but it basically makes it easier to litigate because it's a more modern piece of legislation that doesn't have to go through the federal courts. And just within the last couple weeks, Yakima County ended up settling out of court to remedy the way that they conduct their voting system, because once again, the evidence showed that the current rules prevented the Latino community from being able to have access to the ability to elect candidates of their own choice at the county level. And so that brings us to the congressional level. And this is actually very interesting. On the Federal Voting Rights Act, from the Federal Voting Rights Act standpoint, if you can show two things, you can compel the creation of a so-called majority-minority district. And those two things are, number one, racially polarized voting patterns that show that people of color, protected class, have discrete, different voting preferences from the white voters in that same community. And all of this voting history that we have in Yakima has demonstrated that. We know that there are racially polarized voting patterns in Yakima. The second thing that you have to be able to show is that under the Federal Voting Rights Act, there are enough people of color living in the area that you could draw a majority-minority district, a district wherein the people of color are in the numerical majority of voters, of the electorate, not just total population. And about a decade ago, we were close. Yakima almost could be drawn as a majority-minority electorate, but it couldn't quite make it. And so we ended up having a district that was majority-minority by population, but not of the electorate. But the population of communities of color in Yakima have grown so much over the last decade that they have now crossed that threshold where, even based off of the 2019 American Community Survey data, there are enough people of color there that the evidence is very strong that the commission needs to make a majority-minority voting age population for people of color out there in Yakima. So it's a really exciting time for the folks in Yakima Nation and the Latino community out there to finally be able to elect candidates at all levels of government, city, county, and Congress. Or not Congress, excuse me, state legislature. We're not at Congress yet.
That's a really helpful overview of some of the implications. For one thing that people can know is that if the commissioners are not able to agree on both legislative and congressional maps, it actually gets, by the deadline in mid-November, this gets kicked over to the Supreme Court. And for a number of states outside of Washington that have had their maps, some of them have already gone to litigation over these same Voting Rights Act issues. Margo, I wonder if you had anything to say shortly about the way we drew our maps in Yakima and what that allowed us to do in terms of representation of majority-minority district over in the Tri-Cities. For folks following at home, you can go to redistrictingjusticewa.org and find the district maps there to follow along, because I don't think we have those to pull up right now. But Margo, do you have anything to add quickly about what a Yakima map could do for the Latino community in Tri-Cities?
Yeah, very quickly. I mean, not garnering as much attention as Yakima, but essentially in Pasco, it does the same thing. Like at a county level as well. Like Pasco is split between legislative districts and the city, Tri-Cities at large. Like the community has been saying that it wants to keep Pasco predominantly Latinx in one district. So East Pasco specifically. And so yeah, that I think that would help a lot of voting POC folks over there.
And Colin, would you have anything to add there about what people can watch for in the Tri-Cities, what's possible, and what you saw from commissioners?
I won't add too much. I think Margo actually did pretty much everything that I would hit on. I guess the one thing I would just flag is for folks to keep in mind that municipal lines only show so much of communities. That different like how we talked about Seattle. South Seattle has a very different population by income, by race, and by other metrics than other parts of the city. And the same thing is true even in the Tri-Cities. And so the most important thing that we can advocate for is keeping communities of interest that have shared experience, shared background, shared values together, because that's how you end up giving communities the ability to elect candidates that they prefer.
All right, I think we can That's gives a lot of good table setting in Central Washington. I think we could take things back and cover where the region where there are the most majority minority districts that cover a single county, and that's in King County. And this was a place where we took a lot of feedback from community-based organizations, Black and Brown organizations, around how commissioners should approach South King County. So, Andrew, do you want to share a little bit about the proposal that the coalition behind Redistricting Justice for Washington came up with, and how that differed with the approaches that each of the commissioners took this last week?
Yes, definitely. And again, these maps have been voted on by dozens of community members, real people in South King County that have been organized by our community coalition groups. So for South King County, the biggest things we're focused on, again, is increasing the number of citizen voting age population LDs. We're going to highlight the 37th as the only majority POC CFAP LD in South King right now. And our two target LDs are the 11th and 33rd to be majority CVAP. And then we also want to increase where it's not possible to have a majority CVAP district, increasing the number of majority minority LDs in South King County and preserving ones that already exist. And so for those, specifically looking at districts 30 and 47. And again, CVAP is citizen voting age population, or the eligible voters in the electorate. So on all four of the maps, I can briefly go over them. There's some similarities. We applaud the commissioners for drawing maps in generally the 37th, 11th, 33rd, and 30th that do maximize majority people of color populations. So yeah, we appreciate that win. That was a good win. But now we'll get into each of the four commissioners' maps one by one. So for Sims, Sims drew a good 37th, keeping the International District Chinatown in the 37th and drawing a majority voting age population district there. Same thing with the 11th. One thing across all of the commissioners' 33rd proposal that we would like is to try to draw the waterfront areas in the 33rd districts into either the 30th or ideally the 34th LD, just so we can try to get that 33rd LD to a majority minority CVAP district. And that goes for Commissioner Sims as well. We also appreciate Sims' 30th district as majority minority. And then we appreciate Commissioner Sims drawing the 47th LD. And this is kind of one of the biggest, this is probably the biggest contentious district in these proposals, the 47th district as majority minority. So that covers Sims. Overall, a strong map. Just would like to see the 33rd have less waterfront areas. For Commissioner Graves, we in the 37th district, we generally appreciate it, except that he again splits the Chinatown International District down I-5. We want to make sure that that area in the northern part goes farther west to include all of the Chinatown International District. The 11th is drawn relatively well, although we could move that a little bit farther west to include parts of Boulevard Park, South Park, and Skyway to get that to a majority CVAP. Same thing with the 33rd. We could cut out the waterfront areas just like Commissioner Sims to make that closer to a majority CVAP district. 30th is okay for Graves, majority minority. And then the 47th here was drawn to make it a majority white district when, as we saw with Commissioner Sims' proposal, the 47th can be a majority minority district. And so we want to see with Commissioner Graves, him to try to draw in more communities of color in South King County, particularly Auburn, and also parts of further into Kent to get that to a majority minority. And then for Commissioner Walkinshaw, pretty similar to Commissioner Sims' proposal, good 37th district, a solid 11th district. Just like Commissioner Sims, we would like to see the 33rd have less waterfront areas that are higher income and whiter. Good 33rd district, and then good 47th district as majority minority, making sure that stays there. So Walkinshaw, very similar to Commissioner Sims. Both are solid. And Commissioner Fain's proposal has similar issues with Commissioner Graves'. It splits the Chinatown International District and carves parts of it or all of it away from the 37th district. That should be a fix. For the 11th district, this one was a bit odder. We, again, would like to see, or I think the primary issue with this 11th district is it includes very, very wealthy parts of Newcastle, and I think going up all the way into South Bellevue. Having those wealthier communities in this, predominantly and historically working class district dilutes the voting power of working class communities of color in the Tukwila, Renton, Boulevard Park, South Park area. And then 33rd, same feedback. 30th is a good district. And then 47th, again, we want to see that gap be filled between the 30th and 47th in South King. So the 47th can be majority minority. Right now, Commissioner Fain has marginalized communities of color in that area by making a majority white 47th. And I think that wraps up South King County LDs.
That was a great run through. I think for people who are watching now who may not have joined at the beginning, the reason that these demographics are so important is because of the fundamental flaws in our redistricting system. In a proportional system where your amount of votes reflected to the amount of power you have in the legislature or in the congressional delegation, all this sort of line drawing and like careful analysis about this neighborhood and that neighborhood wouldn't matter as much because you would already have proportional representation. But in a winner takes all system where a district that is 51% white or 51% people of color is the difference between communities of color on their own being able to elect the leaders of their choice or not, is why these sorts of small points, especially the ones that Andrew is touching on in the international district, become so important. So that's something for people to note, and would encourage any questions you have down in the comments as we move on to the our last area. One of the things I want to bring you and Colin here, maybe before we do that, are there any voting rights implications you see between the maps that the commissioners drew around South King County?
So the short answer is maybe, probably. The longer answer is there hasn't been the same level of documentation of racially polarized voting patterns in King County as there has been in Central Washington. So it's harder to say for sure. But that said, we know based off of reality that more often than not, there are racially polarized voting patterns in more and more communities around the country. And so it is quite likely that if we aren't doing our best to maximize the number of districts that are majority electorate people of color, that there are going to be more and more potential litigation under the Voting Rights Act.
Thanks for that. And we'll turn to the last county, and then we're not covering all of the legislative districts, just want to focus on some of the most important areas for people to watch. So take us through Snohomish and what people can expect there, what the coalition was able to produce, and how the commissioners stacked up.
Yeah, so I'll keep this relatively quick because now we're tight on time. Important thing to say at the top, Snohomish County is one of the fastest growing counties in the country for non-white population growth, which is very cool. And based off of the current demographic trends, we have the opportunity to create the first ever majority minority district in Snohomish County in the form of the 21st district, ranging from along the I-5 corridor, going up to about South Everett and down past Linwood. This is a racially diverse, working class community that has a lot of common experiences. Unfortunately, we can see for each of the four commissioners' maps that this potential was not tapped. All four maps have something in common, which is that they take the working class, predominantly POC core along I-5 and connect it way out to the waterfront along the Mukilteo, Edmonds, Kingston, or not quite Kingston, or water regions. And the effect of this is that the working class voice of the people of color that live along the I-5 corridor have their voting power diluted by the much wealthier, much wider portions of the populations that live out there. And you can see here on this map, on the left, look at the waterfront along the edge of the 21st, and you can see that it's that shade of yellow that means below 25% people of color. And then look at the right, and you can see where the people of color live, and that's why in our map, you can see that we have drawn a map keeping people of color together. All of the commissioner maps do this. So in no instance are we taking advantage of this, and we really need to. And we can, I guess, quickly go through the other commissioners. I don't have anything more to say because it's the same criticism for all four. Mukilteo and Edmonds don't share experiences with the downtown core along I-5 of Linwood.
I think this is actually a good point to shortly touch on. One thing is, right now in the 21st, there are, I think, 3 people in that delegation. There's one of them is Latina, and she lives kind of where the 21st would be. And you know, whether intentionally or not, there's something that the Democratic commissioners doing. Can you shortly touch on that, and then we can go over Fain, and then go to Q&A before.
Yeah, so this is actually true for every commissioner's map except for Fain's. As drawn, every proposal would keep the 3 current incumbents of the 21st legislative district in the legislature in their current seats. And it just so happens that one of them lives up on the northern end of the peninsula near Mukilteo. One of them lives near the water in Edmonds, and then Representative Lillian Ortiz Self, well, as you mentioned, lives in where the current 21st would be. The only district that does not contain, the only commissioner's proposal does not contain all 3 incumbents is Commissioner Fain's, but he still does keep 2 of the incumbents together. And so, you know, like you mentioned, that this is the way the district has been drawn historically, but just because we've always drawn it that way doesn't mean we always should, especially when we're trying to keep communities of interest together.
It's awesome. And people remember that from the top that one of the priorities, it's not one of the priorities for the commissioners to consider incumbency. In that case, you know, it would be the class scenario of politicians picking their voters rather than voters picking their politicians. So I think before we touch on the questions, you know, today was when the congressional maps came out. And Andrew, I'm wondering if you could walk us through some of the other things outside of the majority minority congressional district of the 9th that you noticed.
Yeah, it's kind of on the same topic of making sure that we're drawing maps that protect voters and communities, not incumbents. And Commissioner Sims, especially Commissioner Sims and Commissioner Walkinshaw's maps in King County's congressional districts, which include the 1st district, the 7th district, the 9th district, and the 8th district. There are clear patterns that of the commissioners protecting Democratic incumbents in those areas. So you see in the 1st district, it has the southern point of the 1st district kind of snakes into Medina, where the current 1st District Congresswoman Susan Delbeni lives, and then also in Commissioner Walkinshaw's district. If we can slide to that. Same kind of thing right there. In addition, going between both Walkinshaw's 9th District proposal and Commissioner Sims' 9th District proposal, it draws out parts of the east side, like Mercer Island, North Bellevue, but it keeps in South Bellevue and Newcastle, which is the area in which Congressman Adam Smith lives. We don't necessarily know for sure whether this was the commissioner's intention, although it looks pretty clear. And we just want to make sure that communities of color, particularly communities of color in all communities, get fair district lines and not the and we should not be prioritizing fair district lines for one constituent of the district, the incumbent. So we hope to see maps from all of the commissioners that do not consider incumbents and do not place the issues and the priorities of incumbents living in their districts over map proposals that support communities. And, you know, specifically, I think, you know, Walkinshaw's 9th district, it looks exactly like Redistricting Justice for Washington's, except for keeping parts of South Bellevue and cutting out the Chinatown International District as an example of wanting to make sure that the Chinatown International District community takes priority of being in a majority POC 9th district rather than an incumbent does. And yeah, I think that final point I wanted to touch on with the Snohomish County maps, making sure we're prioritizing communities of color over incumbents.
Yeah, so some of these, there's definitely a lot of politics involved. Not to mention the fact that one thing people aren't noticing here that is probably a big part of the discourse is the partisan implications or the partisan data, and which is always interesting because the commissions themselves are appointed by partisan bodies and probably thinking about what's best for their parties. But when you look at the redistricting site, no partisan data to be found. So that way they're perhaps in their nonpartisan role. Well, that's been really great and super informative. I think it's a good deep dive for people who are just not tuning into redistricting. I want to take some time to get some questions from people who are watching on Periscope, on Twitter, or on Facebook Live. If there are questions you have about the process, how to get involved, what's the most effective way to get involved, about any of the maps or districts we didn't touch on, this would be a great time.
In the meantime, while folks are asking questions, please go to www.redistrictingjusticewa.org. Sign in support of our map proposals. If you take a look at a lot of our top priorities right now, sign in support for them. It helps make these maps a reality, and sign up to support the coalition as a whole to get looped into the work that we're doing. Right now, we're organizing for the October 5th and 9th public outreach meetings from the commission. So even if you don't support RJW, we still encourage you to sign up to testify at those commission hearings.
Great. One question we've gotten has been about Pierce County and whether there are any possible majority minority districts there. Folks can go to the website to see the proposals created by organizations like the Tacoma Metropolitan Urban League, Asia Pacific Cultural Center, APACE, and the organizers there. Political Destiny Pairs and a bunch of others. But Con, what do you have to share about what's possible in Pierce County?
Yeah, so it is possible to make a majority minority district in Pierce County. And our maps show that it's actually possible to make two. One of them would be kind of narrow, about 52% people of color voting age population. So it might not be a majority people of color electorate, but it probably will be by the end of the decade. And that would be the 28th district. The 29th district, though, is where we could make a 57% POC voting age population district that it was going to be right on the edge of being a majority POC electorate. And we have some of the commissioners' maps are kind of close to ours, but the RJW maps really are, I would argue, a lot more cohesive. That what ends up happening is Tacoma ends up getting split into two or three, or into three or more different ways in each of the commissioners' proposals. And Tacoma is one of those communities that has shared experiences and shared backgrounds. But like Seattle, not all of Tacoma is the same. South Tacoma is a lot more working class and has a lot more people of color in it than the north end of Tacoma. That's, again, on the waterfront. And our proposal would keep the vast majority of South Tacoma together in one district, and then just grab a little bit of the outlying suburban areas that have similar income levels, similar demographic makeup, and so on. the other proposals, they aren't bad. They do create at least one majority minority district, although not two, which they could do. But they also are combining places like South Tacoma with Spanaway and rural suburban, more rural parts of Pierce County that don't really have that same set of experiences as folks in South Tacoma do. And so we would definitely encourage folks that think it's important for communities with common values to vote together to advocate for our maps on RJW.
Andrew, you've worked a lot with some of the organizations that thought really hard about the trade-offs in Pierce County. Anything you would add from what Colin just shared?
I just want to add in that I worked specifically with Political Destiny, Sidonia Young, and got in contact with the Tacoma Black Collective. We presented the maps there, and we have overwhelming support from over 80 Black Tacoman community members for the RJW maps. So not only is it smart for communities of color in Tacoma, but it's backed by communities of color in Tacoma.
That's really important for people to know. Yeah, it's not an accident that people want to see more representation in their communities. Margot, we got one question in the chat about what happens if the commissioners aren't able to reach an agreement by the mid-November deadline.
Yeah, so essentially the process is that if the commissioners can't reach an agreement by November 15th, which is the deadline, then it ends up in the Supreme Court. And so that would, I think, allow the public to continue to voice their concerns on any of the maps. And then I'm not sure what else comes afterwards. I don't know if anyone else has the answer to that.
Colin, is there anything you would add to the process?
Not really, just that there would probably be not really. Other than the one thing I would point out that is a parallel I would hope folks, the Supreme Court would consider that they don't have to consider, is that under the Washington Voting Rights Act for smaller districts, like at the county or municipal level, when it's time to consider alternative proposals, they actually have to do a community listening process. They can't just pull something out of a hat. They have to hold a number of sessions available in different languages. They have to publicize these. They have to request citizen input. And even if that's not required of the Supreme Court, if they have to make any decisions, it would certainly be, I think, in the best interests of Washington communities to make sure that, again, politicians aren't drawing the lines to represent themselves, but voters are drawing the lines to get represented.
And then at the very end of the process, the legislature ratifies what the commissioners have sent over and are only able to change, I believe, 1% of population per district. So really what the commissioners come up with, if three of them are able to agree, three of the voting members are able to agree on both the legislative and congressional maps by mid-November, that's really it. If they're able to agree on one, maybe they agree on what to do about the congressional maps, but not the legislative, it goes to the state Supreme Court, as Margot has noted. And if anything really wild was to happen, the legislature would still need 2/3 vote to change that. So what's going to happen next is the commission is going to have some public hearings, and they're virtual. Folks can join. There's language support. And if you go to redistrictingjustice.org or you go to the Redistricting Justice for Washington Facebook page or the Instagram or the Twitter, you'll be able to find a graphic for when those hearings are. The most important thing is that there's just a few weeks to give, that verbal written testimony, but you don't have to wait. You can go to the state redistricting website, which we're going to put down below soon. And you can make comments on each one of the commissioners' maps. Maybe some of the points that we raised here you found compelling and you agreed with. Let the commissioners know. That's going to be the most effective way to get your voice heard and maybe even change the minds of some of the commissioners. They've been doing town halls and meetings, and I think they're pretty responsive to what people would like to see and how voters would like to be represented. And of course, if people are interested in some of the longer term solutions, they can also visit representingwa.org and join the fight for proportional representation, ranked choice voting. So we're never dealing with gerrymandering or any of those issues. Again, we can just have a normal, good, balanced, multiracial democracy. Any last words that people want to share with folks before we close out here? All right, I will also plug our newsletter, The Tally. If people go to wacommunityalliance.org, you can subscribe to The Tally. We're going to have the analysis that we went over here in punchy, funny, and written format at the convenience of your inbox. So please do that, and we'll let everybody go and have a great evening. Thanks for nerding out with us.
Thanks so much, everyone.
All right.